Is it too late to save American democracy? I don't think so. For years, I've been making a list of 10 ideas that would make our democratic institutions work better for everyone. Some of these are easier to achieve than you might think. Others are more long-term. But if we want to see these changes, we've got to start demanding them now. So please share this video. Let's start with the Electoral College. In a democracy, shouldn't the presidential candidate who gets the most votes win? You'd think. But the Electoral College has put the popular vote loser in the White House 5 times now. There's a way we can fix this that's easier than you'd think. Watch this. Should someone else's vote count more than yours? For 80% of Americans, that's exactly what's happening. Their vote for president isn't nearly as valuable as the vote of someone in a so-called swing state. Most of us live in states that have become so predictably Democratic or Republican that we're taken for granted by candidates. Presidential elections now turn on the dwindling number of swing states that could go either way, which gives voters in those states huge leverage. The 2020 election came down to just over 40,000 votes, spread across just 3 swing states. 2016 came down to fewer than 80,000 votes, also across 3 states. In those elections, the national popular vote wasn't nearly that close. In fact, in the last 5 elections, the winners of the popular vote beat their opponents by an average of 5 million votes. The current state-by-state electoral college system of electing presidents is creating ever closer contests in an ever smaller number of closely divided states for elections that aren't really that close. Not only that, but these razor-thin swing state margins can invite post-election recounts, audits, and lawsuits, even attempted coups. A losing candidate might be able to overturn 40,000 votes with these techniques. Overturning 5 million would be nearly impossible. The current system presents a growing threat to the peaceful transition of power. It also strips us of our individual power. If you're a New York Republican or an Alabama Democrat, presidential candidates have little incentive to try and win your vote under the current system. They don't need broad popular support as much as a mobilized base in a handful of swing states. Campaigning to a smaller and more radical base is also leading to uglier, more divisive campaigns. And it's becoming more and more likely that candidates are elected president without winning the most votes nationwide. It's already happened twice this century. But there is an alternative. And it starts with getting our states to join the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Now, don't let that mouthful put you off. It could save our democracy. This compact would guarantee the presidency to the candidate who receives the most popular votes nationwide without a constitutional amendment. How does it work? The Constitution assigns each state a number of electors equal to its number of representatives and senators. As of now, the total number of electors is 538. So anyone who gets 270 or more of those electoral college votes becomes president. Article 2 of the Constitution allows state legislatures to award their electors any way they want. So all that's needed is for states with a total of at least 270 electoral votes to agree to award all their electoral votes to the presidential candidate who wins the national popular vote. The movement to do this is already underway. 17 states and the District of Columbia have joined the compact, agreeing that once enough states join, all their electoral votes will go to the popular vote winner. Together, states currently in the compact have 209 electoral votes. So we just need a few more states with at least 61 electors to join the compact, and it's done. Popular vote initiatives have recently been introduced in Arizona, Michigan, North Carolina, Nevada, and Virginia, which if passed would bring the total to 270 and put the compact into effect. Now, naturally, this plan will face legal challenges. There are a lot of powerful interests who stand to benefit by maintaining the current system. But if we keep up the fight and get enough states on board, America will never again elect a president who loses the national popular vote. No longer would 80% of us be effectively disenfranchised from presidential campaigns, and a handful of votes in swing states would no longer determine the winner. If you want to know more or get involved, click the link below to read about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. If your state is not already a member, I urge you to contact your state senators and reps to get your state on board. Some of the biggest blows to our democracy have come from the Supreme Court. It increased the power of big money over our politics with Citizens United and decreased the power of voters by gutting the Voting Rights Act. And by striking down Roe v. Wade, it's even stripped Americans of power over their own bodies. Fortunately, there are 3 ways we can improve the Supreme Court. Take a look at this. The Supreme Court is off the rails. And it's only going to get worse unless we fight to reform it. Public trust and approval of the court have hit historic lows due to seemingly partisan decisions and a growing number of ethics scandals. Here are 3 key reforms Congress should enact to restore legitimacy to our nation's highest court. Number 1, establish a code of ethics. Every other federal judge has to sign on to a code of ethics, except for Supreme Court justices. This makes no sense. Judges on the highest court should be held to the highest ethical standards. Congress should impose a code of ethics on Supreme Court justices. At the very least, any ethical code should ban justices from receiving personal gifts from political donors and anyone with business before the court. Clarify when justices with conflicts of interest should remove themselves from cases, prohibit justices from trading individual stocks, and establish a formal process for investigating misconduct. Number 2, enact term limits. Article 3 of the Constitution says judges may hold their office during good behavior, but it does not explicitly give Supreme Court justices lifetime tenure on the highest court, even though that's become the norm. Term limits would prevent unelected justices from accumulating too much power over the course of their tenure, and would help diffuse what has become an increasingly divisive confirmation process. Congress should limit Supreme Court terms to 18 years, after which justices move to lower courts. Number 3, expand the court. The Constitution does not limit the Supreme Court to 9 justices. In fact, Congress has changed the size of the court 7 times. It should do so again in order to remedy the extreme imbalance of today's Supreme Court. Now, some may decry this as radical court packing. That's pure rubbish. The real court packing occurred when Senate Republicans refused to even consider a Democratic nominee to the Supreme Court on the fake pretext that it was too close to the 2016 election, but then confirmed a Republican nominee just days before the 2020 election. Rather than allow Republicans to continue exploiting the system, expanding the Supreme Court would actually unpack the court. This isn't radical. It's essential. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Making these reforms happen won't be easy. We're up against big, moneyed interests who will fight to keep their control of the nation's most important court. But these key reforms have significant support from the American people, who have lost trust in the court. The Supreme Court has no real power to enforce its judgments. It has no army. It has no control over spending. Its power comes from only one source: the trust of the people. With neither the sword nor the purse, trust is all it has. We've now covered reforms to the executive and judicial branches of government. Now for the legislative. How can we improve Congress? Here's one big way. One of the biggest challenges to our democracy occurs when states draw congressional district lines with the principal goal of helping one political party and hurting the other. It's called partisan gerrymandering. Unlike racial gerrymandering, drawing districts to reduce the political power of racial minorities, which the Supreme Court has found to violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, partisan gerrymandering would seem to violate the First Amendment because it punishes some voters for their political views. In North Carolina in 2016, for example, Republicans won 10 of the state's 13 House seats, with just 53% of the popular vote. In the 2018 elections, because of partisan gerrymandering, Democrats will need to win the national popular vote by nearly 11 points to win a majority in the House of Representatives. No party has won this margin in decades. So what can be done? Regardless of the Supreme Court, state courts could rule against partisan gerrymandering under their state constitutions, as happened this year in Pennsylvania, where the state court invalidated a Republican congressional map that gave Republicans 13 out of 18 congressional seats, even though the state is about evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. The state court implemented its own map for the 2018 election, creating districts that are less biased in favor of Republicans. Second, states can delegate the power to design districts to independent or bipartisan groups. Some states, like California, have already done this. But if you want your state to end gerrymandering, you're going to have to get actively involved and demand it. After all, this is our democracy. It's up to us to make it work. We also need to make sure the people we send to Congress are more focused on us than using their positions to make a quick buck. Here's one common sense way to do that. Members of Congress use privileged information to make money on the stock market, while they're supposed to be working for you. Make no mistake, it's legalized corruption. There's no good reason for elected officials to trade in individual stocks at all. Unless you have special insider knowledge, buying and selling individual stocks is a terrible way to get rich. It's gambling, plain and simple. That's why many Americans with retirement accounts prefer to invest in index funds, which are tied to the performance of the entire stock market. But many members of Congress continue to invest in individual stocks, and some do quite well. How do they do it? Well, consider this. Just before the economy crashed in 2008, several lawmakers frantically shifted their holdings to safer investments. This frenzy came just after private meetings with Treasury officials who had warned that an economic disaster was imminent. I imagine most of you weren't invited to these meetings. I certainly wasn't. But those lawmakers were and could have chosen to act on that information. When this story came to light, people were naturally outraged.
I think it's highly unethical. I think it's highly offensive and wrong.
After immense public pressure, Congress passed the Stock Act in 2012, which formally banned insider trading. The act also required lawmakers to disclose their stock sales and those of their spouses within 45 days. By forcing these transactions to be public, the hope was that lawmakers would stop making questionable trades. And it worked, well, partially. In January 2020, a handful of senators, including Richard Burr, Dianne Feinstein, and Kelly Loeffler, all made significant trades after receiving a classified briefing on COVID-19, well before the public knew the full extent of the threat. Few, if any, lawmakers have faced serious consequences for violating the spirit or the letter of the law, as insider trading is notoriously difficult to prove. In 2021 alone, news outlets identified 47 lawmakers who failed to properly disclose their trades. Their punishment? Nothing. Lawmakers are supposed to face a paltry $200 fine for failing to report on time, but congressional ethics officials usually waive it. There's an obvious solution to all this. Bar members of Congress from trading individual stocks. The proposed Ban Conflicted Trading Act does just this. Lawmakers would have 6 months after being elected to sell their individual holdings, transfer them to a blind trust over which they have no control, or hold onto them until they leave office without trading them. But Congress has yet to hold a vote on this bill. even though 67% of Americans agree it's a good idea to ban members of Congress from trading individual stocks. There's good precedent for this. In October 2021, the Federal Reserve, following its own stock trading scandal, announced that Fed policymakers would no longer be allowed to trade individual stocks and bonds. Why shouldn't Congress do the same? As usual, follow the money. A majority of lawmakers are millionaires who likely get a sizable chunk of their wealth from investments and trades. So they won't support this bill unless there's enough public outcry to make them. And that's where you come in. With distrust in government near an all-time high, even the appearance of a conflict of interest hurts our democracy. Members of Congress are elected to represent the interests of the people, not the money in their brokerage accounts. Banning members of Congress from trading individual stocks is a no-brainer. Let's get it done. Now that we've tackled the three branches of government, it's time to talk about the so-called fourth estate, the media. There's a specific media bias that's endangering our democracy, and it's not the kind of bias most people talk about. Here is what I mean. The mainstream media has historically tried to balance left and right in its political coverage and present what it views as a reasonable center.
Telling both sides of a controversial story.
Now that may sound good in theory, but the old politics no longer exists, and the former labels left versus right are outdated. Today, it's democracy versus authoritarianism, voting rights versus white supremacy. There's no reasonable center between these positions, no justifiable compromise. Equating them is misleading and dangerous.
When they say they're too far to the left.
It's Meet the Press. Fretting about the direction of the party.
You hear the mainstream media say, for example, that certain, quote, Republican and Democratic lawmakers are emerging as troublemakers within their parties, unquote. These reports equate Republican lawmakers who are actively promoting Trump's big lie that their 2020 election was stolen with Democratic lawmakers who are fighting to extend health care and other programs to help people. But these are not equivalent. Trump's big lie is a direct challenge to American democracy. Even if you disagree with providing Americans better access to health care, it's not going to destroy our system of government. You also hear that both sides are gripped by equally dangerous extremism.
Both the radical right and the left.
Growing trend of far-right extremism.
The rise of left-wing mobs.
Far-right terrorists.
Labeling them radical left and radical right suggests that the responsible position somehow is between these so-called extremes. Can we get real? One side is trying to protect and preserve voting rights. The other side is trying to suppress votes under the guise of election integrity. But there isn't and never was a problem of election integrity. The whole issue of election integrity in the 2020 election was manufactured by Donald Trump and his big lie about voter fraud.
If you count the legal votes, I easily win. If you count the illegal votes, they can try to steal the election from us.
And was bought and propagated by the Republican Party. Today's Republican Party is behind what historians regard as the biggest attack on voting rights since Jim Crow. But the media frames this as a right versus left battle that's just politics as usual. Equating the two sides is false and dangerous. Or compare the coverage of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert on the one hand with the coverage of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar on the other.
Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene is sparking controversy again.
We should be looking at the most extreme on both sides, and I would bring up Congresswoman Ilhan Omar.
What you are talking about, just big picture, is a radical agenda compared to the way politics is done right now.
You'd think they were all equally out of the mainstream, some on the extreme right, some on the extreme left. Well, that's bunk. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, in addition to spreading dangerous conspiracy theories, harassing colleagues, and promoting bigotry, don't actually legislate or do anything for their constituents. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar both organized to help everyday people, deliver for their constituents, and have pushed legislation to provide universal school meals, expand affordable housing, and combat the climate crisis. Equating all these lawmakers suggests that the responsible position is halfway between hateful, delusional conspiracy theories on the one hand, and efforts to fight white supremacy, save the planet, and empower working people on the other. It's similar to what the media did following Donald Trump's infamous condemnation of both sides.
I think there's blame on both sides.
After the deadly violence sparked by neo-Nazis and white supremacists in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. In the ensuing weeks, America's 6 top mainstream newspapers used just as much space condemning anti-Nazi counter-protesters as they did actual neo-Nazis. But research shows white supremacists pose a significantly graver threat than those trying to stop them. White supremacists are animated by racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of bigotry, violence, and hate. Battling white supremacy is not the same as advocating it. Passing laws to prevent voter suppression is not the same as passing laws to suppress votes. Fighting for our democracy is not the same as seeking to destroy it. The media, equating both sides, one left and one right, suggests there's a moderate middle between hate and inclusion, between democracy and proto-fascism. This is misleading, dangerous, and morally wrong. Don't fall for it. The most important part of our democracy is the people, the voting public, us. And there's something we could be doing a lot better. Watch this message from my friend, Heather McGee.
Did you know that the largest block of voters isn't Democrats or Republicans? It's people who don't usually vote. What would happen if everyone voted? The missing voters are predominantly the people who face the largest barriers to economic opportunity and security, and who support the most progressive ideas for how to fix our nation. They're people of color, young people, people with lower incomes who are often working multiple jobs and don't get time off to vote. So what would happen if everyone voted? Transformation. It turns out that the people who are most likely to vote in every election have different priorities than those who don't. On issue after issue, a majority of more affluent, regular voters opposed the progressive option, while a majority of lower-income non-voters supported it. Just look at the numbers on these powerful ideas. Increasing aid to the poor, government guaranteeing jobs and high living standards, a high enough minimum wage to keep workers out of poverty. Politicians are accountable to the people who put them in office, and right now a donor class that is whiter, wealthier, and more male than the population as a whole is voting with their money and at the ballot box. But when we, the people, all vote in numbers, they will be accountable to us. The barriers that many potential voters face are well known. Right-wing politicians have created a whole arsenal of tactics, from photo ID requirements to reducing early voting, closing polling places, purging voters who are already registered from the rolls, and barring people with criminal records from voting. All designed to keep people of color, young people, and people with lower incomes from casting a ballot. And don't forget the tens of millions of aspiring Americans who desperately want a path to citizenship. By blocking their path, the right wing is blocking their vote, too. But what if we pushed back and demanded a government that helps citizens to vote rather than suppresses our vote? One way is to eliminate the biggest barrier to voting in the first place and automatically register every eligible citizen through automatic voter registration. Instead of requiring people to seek out the proper forms, offices, and deadlines for voter registration, states can automatically enroll their residents using information they already have on file. At Demos, we crunched the numbers and estimated that automatic voter registration nationwide would instantly add 27 million new registered voters to the rolls, more than half of the 51 million eligible people who are currently unregistered. But don't just take my word for it. The state of Oregon implemented AVR in 2016, and here's what they found. 95% of people who were registered through AVR were first-time voters in the 2016 elections. And there are other practical fixes for low voter participation. Why not enable people to create or update their registrations the same day they vote, rather than making us meet an arbitrary cutoff? Why not let everybody vote at home and send our ballot in the mail? And why do we have to vote on a Tuesday? Just think about the kinds of changes we could make if everyone voted. We could enact policies to create better paying jobs and better working conditions. We could rebuild opportunity through debt-free college. We could end mass incarceration and clear the path to citizenship. We could protect our families with universal health care, reproductive justice, and a real safety net. And we could finally check the corporate power that has polluted our democracy. These aren't pie-in-the-sky goals. These are the ideas that most Americans support, but these ideas are underrepresented as long as we are underrepresented.
With all these ideas to strengthen our democracy, there's one major thing working against us: big money. Here's how it took control of our politics, and how we can take it back. What's the difference between you and a giant corporation like Amazon? According to the Supreme Court, nothing. Corporations are apparently people with the same free speech rights under the Constitution that you and I have. But wait, if corporations break the law, they can't be imprisoned. You can be. Corporations can't be executed. If you commit a felony in a state like Texas, you could be. Corporations that cause accidents or go bankrupt enjoy limited liability, so their investors are off the hook. If you cause an accident or go bankrupt, you're on the hook. And since corporations are just collections of legal agreements, they can live forever. You can't. Worse yet, while they can't actually vote in elections like real people, they can spend virtually unlimited money influencing politics. So how did corporations get turned into people? And who opened the door to their influence over our elections? Thank the Supreme Court. It began in the wake of the Watergate scandal when Congress amended the Federal Election Campaign Act in hopes of preventing future corruption. The amendments limited campaign contributions for individuals as well as spending by candidates and outside groups. A group of senators led by James L. Buckley of New York sued, claiming the law violated candidates' First Amendment rights. In its 1976 Buckley v. Vallejo ruling, the Supreme Court agreed with Buckley that the limits on spending were, quote, direct and substantial restraints on the quantity of political speech, and therefore unconstitutional. Thus, the notion that money is speech was born, and the door to corporate political dominance was unlocked. Next came the 1978 case, First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti. A group of banks and corporations challenged a Massachusetts law limiting corporations' ability to run political ads. They found a sympathetic ear with Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, who before he became a justice authored the infamous memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce calling for more corporate money in American politics. By the way, we have a whole video about the Powell memo. In his majority opinion, Justice Powell wrote that the ads the corporations wanted to run were, quote, the type of speech indispensable to decision-making in a democracy, and this is no less true because the speech comes from a corporation rather than an individual. With that ruling, the court established that corporations are people with the same First Amendment rights as you and me, allowing them to get their foot in the door to take over elections. These cases laid the groundwork for Citizens United in 2010. The court's conservative justices decided that any restrictions on independent political spending by corporations were unconstitutional. The door for corporate influence in politics was finally kicked wide open. Not only were corporations people who could spend money on politics, but they had the right to drown our democracy with as much money as they wanted. The irony is that while the Supreme Court has been busy granting corporations more power to influence elections, they've been stripping actual people of their power to influence elections. In 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder. The conservative justices' ruling stripped the pre-clearance requirement that states with a history of voter suppression must receive clearance from the federal government before enacting any new voting laws. The court essentially ruled that the racial voter suppression that the Voting Rights Act was intended to guard against no longer existed. In the years since, the very same states that were previously subjected to pre-clearance have passed a wave of voter suppression laws. Unsurprisingly, these laws disproportionately affect voters of color. The result? Corporations, legal fictions, held together by collections of contracts, have more power in our democracy than many real people. But these aren't fundamental American principles. They're relatively new ideas concocted by conservatives on the Supreme Court and their deep-pocketed allies. The door to corporate influence can and must be shut again. First, we need a president and Congress committed to getting big money out of politics. That means overturning Citizens United, publicly funding elections, and putting the guardrails back on corporate political spending. While we're slashing the power of corporations, we need to increase the power of the people. Congress needs to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which restores the 1965 Voting Rights Act to its full power, so states can no longer pass voter suppression laws. Finally, we need a Supreme Court that will affirm that money is not speech and corporations are not people. We can get big money out of politics, restore voting rights, and make sure our democracy answers to you, not corporations, once and for all. We've talked about some big ideas so far. It's time to get more specific. There's a bill that explicitly takes on voter suppression, partisan gerrymandering, and the corrupting influence of dark money. Here's what you need to know about it. We do a lot of things right in the US of A. We lead the world in movies, barbecue, space exploration, theme parks. One place we're falling off, the way we do elections. American democracy is designed to give everyone an equal voice in our government. But we've been getting derailed by dark money, gerrymandering, and voter suppression. But there's a way we can get back on track. The Freedom to Vote Act. If you're wondering what it does, the answer is a lot. First, it would bring transparency to limitless amounts of secret money spent by special interest groups in support of political causes, referred to as dark money. Right now, it's impossible to track where all the dark money comes from. It could be billionaires, supervillains.
$100 billion.
Or even worse, it could be coming from foreign governments interfering in our elections. We need to shine a light on where this money is coming from. The Freedom to Vote Act would require any entity spending more than $10,000 on an election to disclose all donors and require online political ads to clearly identify who is behind them. It would also help reduce the influence of big money in our elections by establishing a voluntary small donor matching system for House candidates. Second, the Freedom to Vote Act prohibits partisan gerrymandering. Now, whether you live in a blue state or red one, you don't want your vote diluted by an unfair map. Getting rid of partisan gerrymandering would have the added benefit of eliminating so-called safe seats and make our elections more competitive. One study found that in 2024, 87% of U.S. House seats were considered safe for one party or the other because of partisan gerrymandering. 24 seats were completely uncontested. This can result in representatives who are less responsive to constituents and more ideologically extreme. That's not democracy. Third, the Freedom to Vote Act would bring our voter registration process out of the Stone Age. The United States ranks embarrassingly low in voter registration and turnout. More than a quarter of eligible American voters aren't even registered to vote. This is partly because voter registration requirements vary widely from state to state, with some places making it harder than others. The Freedom to Vote Act would automatically register all eligible voters. Some U.S. states already do this, like Oregon, West Virginia, and Maine. The legislation also sets minimum federal standards for mail-in voting and early in-person voting, making it easier for all eligible Americans to cast their ballots. With these changes, an estimated 3.8 million more Americans would have voted in the 2024 election. That's more than the populations of Rhode Island, Montana, and Delaware put together. And there's more.
Please, sir, I want some more.
Increased election security, a paper trail for every vote, defined standards for election audits, protections for poll workers. If we pass the Freedom to Vote Act, alongside the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to fully restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we can help ensure everybody has an equal say in our democracy. And we can add voting to the list of things Americans do better than anyone else, like chocolate chip cookies. Did I mention chocolate chip cookies? Now that we've addressed the most fundamental challenges to our democracy, there are two more ideas I want to share that might feel a little outside the box. The last time I checked, members of Congress were less popular than cockroaches, root canals, or head lice. So you might be skeptical when I say we need more of them. But watch this. We need to make the House of Representatives bigger. Now, I know what some might be thinking. Make the government bigger? Well, technically, yes, but that's missing the point. We need to expand the House to make the government work better and be more responsive to our needs. Put simply, the House of Representatives does not have enough members to adequately represent all 334 million of us. Now, the House hasn't always had 435 members, and it was never intended to stay the same size forever. For the first 140 years of America's existence, a growing House of Representatives was actually the norm. It wasn't until 1929 that Congress arbitrarily decided to cap the size of the House at 435 members. Back then, each House member represented roughly 200,000 people. But since then, the population of the United States has more than tripled, bringing the average number of constituents up to roughly 760,000. Compared to other democracies, we're one of the worst in terms of how many constituents a single legislator is supposed to represent. Only in India does the average representative have more constituents. And as America continues to grow, it's only going to get worse. Think your representative doesn't listen to you now? Well, you just wait. Not surprisingly, research shows that representatives from more populous House districts tend to be less accessible to their constituents and less popular. Thankfully, the solution is simple. Allow the House to grow. Increasing the number of representatives should be a no-brainer for at least 4 reasons. First, logically, more representatives would mean fewer people in each congressional district, improving the quality of representation. Second, a larger House would be more diverse. Despite recent progress, today's House is still overwhelmingly male, white, and middle-aged. More representatives means more opportunities for young people, people of color, and women to run for office and win. Third, this reduces the power of big money. Running an election in a smaller district would be less expensive, increasing the likelihood that people elect representatives that respond to their interests rather than big corporations and the wealthy. Fourth, this would help reduce the Electoral College's bias towards small states in presidential elections. As more heavily populated states gain more representatives in Congress, they also gain more electoral votes. Now, some might say that a larger House of Representatives would be unwieldy and unmanageable. Well, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK, countries with smaller populations than us, all have larger legislatures, and they manage just fine. Others might say that it would be too difficult or expensive to accommodate more representatives in the Capitol. Are there even enough chairs? Seriously? Look, we've done it before. The current Capitol has been expanded to accommodate more members several times, and it can be done again. A building should not be an obstacle to a more representative democracy. Increasing the size of the House is an achievable goal. We don't even need a constitutional amendment. Congress only needs to pass a law to expand the number of representatives, which it's done numerous times. And as it happens, there is a bill. In fact, two. Each would add more than 130 seats to the House and lower the number of constituents a typical representative serves from 760,000 to a little over 570,000. Plus, there's a mechanism for adding new members down the line. These bills are our best chance to restore the tradition of a House that grows in representation as America grows. It's time for us to think big and make the People's House live up to its name. This final idea addresses one of the complaints about voting I hear most frequently. People often feel like neither of the two main choices perfectly represents what they want. But they also worry, with good reason, that voting with their heart for a third choice would be throwing away their vote. What if I told you there's a simple reform that would let you vote with both your head and heart, while also making our politics less ugly? And what if I told you our video about it also features adorable pets? Watch this. Are you sick of the onslaught of negative political ads that air on your TV every election season? The fear-mongering, the half-truths. Believe it or not, there's a simple reform we can enact to make elections more bearable for voters. It's called ranked choice voting, or RCV, and it could change our politics for the better. Here's a quick refresher on how it works, using some pets owned by my colleagues here at Inequality Media. When you head to the ballot box under ranked choice voting, instead of voting for just one candidate, you have the option to rank candidates in order of preference, first, second, third, and so on. So if you're stuck between two preferred candidates for a position, you can spread your preferences out in hopes that one of them wins. I really like Daisy, but I think Beatrix might be a better choice, so I'll rank Beatrix first and Daisy second. When ballots are counted, if none of the candidates gets an outright majority, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and their votes are redistributed to their supporters' second choice candidate. This process continues until a candidate receives over 50% of the vote and is declared the winner. Congratulations, Beatrix. Pretty cool, huh? It's also good for a whole host of other reasons. Implementing RCV could have the added benefit of making our elections, well, nicer. Take the recent election in Alaska, for example.
It's so funny that even in this race, people actually hold our friendship against us.
Compare that to what we see in places without RCV.
Far-left John Fetterman is too far left. He's dangerously liberal on crime.
In a ranked choice voting system, candidates are less likely to engage in this kind of mudslinging because they're not just trying to be a voter's first choice, they also want to be the second choice of voters who are backing their opponents. This can motivate anyone running for office to be more inclusive and appeal to a broader range of voters, helping to connect people who don't always agree on every issue. RCV also allows us to exercise our right to vote without feeling like we're compromising our beliefs or simply voting for the, quote, lesser of two evils. We could vote for the candidates we like the most rather than voting against the candidates we like the least. RCV could also open the door to voters casting their ballots for more third-party candidates. Even if your favorite candidate from your preferred party is not favored to win, that person could still be your first choice without you feeling like you're giving up your vote entirely. If your candidate doesn't make it to the final round, your second or third choice could still end up winning in the final tally. Ranked choice voting can even change the kinds of people who run for office for the better. Potential candidates wouldn't have to avoid running for fear of splitting the vote or spoiling a close election, allowing for a potentially more diverse pool of candidates to run. Again, look at Alaska, where voters used RCV to elect Mary Peltola to Congress, making her the first Alaskan native and first woman to represent the state in the U.S. House. Lastly, ranked choice voting saves everyone, you, me, elections officials, time and money. There would no longer be runoffs, which can be costly and often have lower turnout, which means election results that are less likely to reflect the will of the public. There's a reason why RCV is starting to sweep the nation. It's currently being used by 13 million voters across the country. Ranked choice voting makes elections less painful, less expensive, and can help make our government more inclusive and responsive to what people actually want. Maybe you can organize to make ranked choice voting a reality where you live. Implementing these 10 ideas won't be easy or fast, and no single elected leader can do it on her own. Like all big changes, it's going to take broad, grassroots, popular support. The work starts with spreading the word, so please share this video compilation. Let's make our democracy better together.